Hi, and welcome to the Mavericks Unlimited podcast. I'm your host, Chris Roy, and this is the place to be to make your own rules, do work you love, and live life on your terms. Our guest this week is speaker, writer, and chef Brooke Siem. Brooke describes herself as categorically homeless, having created a life as a digital nomad and entrepreneur. Brooke started as a highly acclaimed chef and food writer in New York. However, she suffered from depression and been on anti-depressants since the age of 15, following the sudden death of her father. So she made a massive change by booking a one-way ticket to Malaysia and getting off the meds. 2 years and 17 countries later, Brooke's focus is on advocating for mental health and wellness without the use of prescription drugs. What I love about Brooke is her direct approach to life, her joy and her passion. She has wisdom beyond her years and is radically compassionate. So let's hear what she had to say. So hi Mavericks, it's Chris here, your host from the Mavericks Unlimited podcast, and I'm talking to you today from the beautiful English Bay Beach in Vancouver, and I have a very wonderful guest with us, Brooke Siem, all the way from Reno, Nevada originally.
Originally from Reno, Nevada.
And now a bit of a global traveller, as it were. So hi Brooke,
Yes.
How are you doing today?
Hi, I'm doing great. I
Good.
mean, it's noon on a Friday and we're on a beach, so
I know, it's hard life, isn't it?
it's very hard at the moment.
I know, right? So Brooke, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Great to have you here. So tell us a little bit about yourself and kind of what you're up to in the world.
Well, I am what I call categorically homeless at this point. My mom gets my mail, and I generally have about, a couple weeks in one place before I move on to somewhere else. But as of late, I've been spending a lot of time here in Vancouver. I started traveling about almost 2 years ago now.
Right.
I had just turned 30, and I was living in New York City. I had been there for 8 years, I think, at that point. And I had just this kind of one of those little tiny moments of realizations where my entire life changed. I didn't quite realize it at the time.
Right.
But the short of it is that when I was 15, my father suddenly passed away, and I had been put on antidepressants and anti-anxiety drugs in order to manage the grief, as they put it, when I was a teenager. And through a series of small decisions that nobody really thought twice about at the time or for the next decade and a half, the drugs were never regulated. They were never monitored. I just stayed on the same set that I was on when I was 15. And 15 years later, I was sitting in my apartment in New York City and had just about to turn 30 and realized that I had spent half my life on these drugs and that I was still incredibly depressed for someone who was apparently being treated for depression.
Wow.
So it was at that point where I'd also had this opportunity to travel around the world, and I kind of just said, well, I can't say no. I wasn't particularly excited about it, to be honest, but I just kind of knew I needed something different. And so I decided to get off all the drugs because I wasn't going to be able to get them reliably filled in the middle of nowhere, Cambodia or Bosnia or wherever I was supposed to be. So I decided to get off of them, and that kind of started about a year-long held process of withdrawal.
Wow.
And, some explorations of different kinds of therapy techniques that ultimately led me to be able to live a life totally free of medication and actually feel like myself and functional and not have, breakdowns in public and all of these things that people really try to do.
So that's a huge process, right? So you had this moment of realization, as you say.
Right.
Then it starts this journey where, there were kind of two journeys, weren't there? There was the journey of traveling around the world, but then the journey of, as you say, coming off the meds, and kind of finding out how to live without that. So tell us a little bit about kind of how you did the second journey, and finding yourself as part of that.
Well, the best way I feel like I can describe it is kind of like going through puberty, but in your 30s.
Oh, wow.
Like, it was kind of that level of bizarre and terrible, because one of the big things that I realized about this whole process, and one of the reasons why I feel like people struggle so much when they're trying to get off of antidepressants. And by the way, I need to preface everything I say with the fact that I am not a doctor, I am not a scientist, I am not a pharmacologist.
Sure.
I only have my own experience, and then, my experience of talking to others who have been in similar situations. So, I am certainly not the authority on this, especially the one, behind in the lab.
Right.
But in my experience, one of the things I've noticed is that, we take these drugs, in the time of need, and then however many years goes by, and all of a sudden when we decide to get off of them, we realize we're not the same person, which makes sense from the fact, it makes sense from the one hand because, you've been on these drugs and you kind of have to get to know yourself without them because your brain chemistry changes. But from just another hand, like literally time has just gone by and you've become used to processing your life one way, and then suddenly when the drugs go away, you process things differently and you're older.
Right.
So it's just kind of like you have to get to know yourself in a way that you didn't do over all those years.
Wow.
And so for me, because I had gone on the drugs when I was 15 and my father died suddenly, and so there was a lot of, grief, PTSD, memory loss around that, and I was young.
Wow.
So by the time I hit 30 and got off the drugs, it was like, who the hell are you? Because the only frame of reference I had was who I was when I was 13 years old.
Right.
Which no one's the same at 13 as they are at 30.
Not.
So but I didn't get a chance to grow into that. It was just suddenly figuring it out. So that's why I felt so much, kind of like a second puberty, because I would have these terrible emotional swings followed by things like, my whole physiologic body was different. I don't think that's a real word, but my whole body was different. Like even, the kinds of music I liked changed. The kinds of clothes I wanted to wear changed because they felt different on my skin. My sense of taste changed. My hearing got more sensitive. My eyesight got better. So it was things like, well, the Brooke of 2 years ago liked to watch TV, liked to watch this program and eat this, and the Brooke of today doesn't like that anymore. So what is she like? Meanwhile, I was crying 5 minutes ago, and now I'm laughing hysterically. Like, kind of what's going on? And it really has a way of making you feel completely insane.
Wow, yeah,
which
quite.
Then makes you think, well, maybe I should go back on the drugs because clearly this isn't normal, and it's a total mind warp.
You're completely reorienting your identity and how you relate to yourself, aren't you?
Right. But yet you feel like there's this place you have to get back to, when in reality you're not trying to get back to something as much as you are trying to reorient yourself in the world you live in now.
Right.
And so for me, when I was going through all this, I also happened to be traveling internationally, which I think was a huge blessing because kind of getting myself right and getting to know myself again was effectively my only purpose at the time. And
right.
In each country I went to, there was almost this sense of, okay, what issue is going to come up here in this country that couldn't come up anywhere else in the world?
Interesting.
For example, like I said, I've had a lot of hearing sensitivity to all sorts of noise that didn't happen when I was medicated, and I don't exactly know why. I've looked for some research on it and I really can't find any, but my guess is just that, everything is more suppressed.
Yep.
So therefore, you're just more aware of everything, including, for me, noises. But when I showed up in Malaysia, that country in Kuala Lumpur is...
That's a noisy city.
It's so noisy. I mean, like, the entire place is under construction, and not like in the kind of organized construction that we get, in the U.S. or whatnot. No, it's like some guy with a hammer just, like, banging on cobblestones on the side of the street from 6 a.m. to midnight, and you're like... What are you doing?
Right.
And then meanwhile there's somebody else down the street, like in the restaurant you're eating in, who has a saw that's cutting through metal, and everyone who's there, like, I don't know, I guess they're just used to it, but I could not handle it.
Wow.
And so I spent a month there kind of getting immersed in that noise, and then I got a break because we went to an island in Thailand right after, where it was, there was lots of lovely waves and, birds chirping, and I kind of got a little break from the cacophony. And then we went to Phnom Penh in Cambodia, which was really noisy again.
Oh, wow.
But I was able to compare the progress I had made from Malaysia to Cambodia. And I did notice that even though I was still having a lot of issues in Cambodia, it wasn't quite as triggering for me.
Right.
Because I had been working on the issues. So...
Wow.
That
Okay.
continued to happen as I kept traveling. There was like a little something in every place, a little gift that's like, okay, you're gonna deal with this month. It's gonna suck, but you'll get there.
Right. So I mean, let's face it. That kind of the second journey, as I referred to it, kind of the identity journey, would have been kind of almost hard enough if you were just in one place.
Right.
But the fact that you were traveling from place to place, almost like a different context to a different context, it's kind of, let's really stir that pot up and really go. So how did you keep yourself as grounded as you could, kind of during that?
Well, I don't think that anybody who was with me at the time would have used the term grounded. I was so far off on a sideways map that, like, I didn't know right from or up from down a lot of the time. But there were a couple things that I kind of tried to keep in mind. And, you know, the first thing is that when I began my period of withdrawal, I started in New York City, and I got off the first drug, and then I got off the last one. I got off the first drug in, I think, March was when I started getting off of it. I got off the last one at the end of July, and then I left at the end of August.
Okay.
So
wow.
some of these drugs have a different length half-life. And so, you know, ones that have a longer half-life stay in your system longer. And the way they explained it to me was that, you know, if you have a drug with a short half-life and you stop taking it, you're going to start feeling the effects of that within a day or two.
Right.
And it could be really intense, but the physical symptoms might only last for, you know, 3 weeks or so. But if you have another drug where it has a longer half-life and you get off of it, then you might not start feeling withdrawal symptoms for a month, 6 weeks, 2 months. So
right.
The last drug I got off of had a longer half-life. So I think that when I got to Malaysia, I started to actually ease into the true withdrawal period of that drug.
Right, okay.
That doesn't hit you over the head with crazy shakes or, you know,
right.
violent tendencies, but suddenly you're just totally off and you don't know why.
Right.
So I think that's what happened when I got to Malaysia. But the things I kept in mind with all of that is, first of all, there were periods in between these really terrible mood swings and these kind of rage-filled outbursts that I would have, where I had these little glimmers of feeling like myself in a way that I had never felt before as an adult.
Right.
And it was a little hard to explain, but it just kind of felt like, you know, the cellophane on my body had been lifted, or there was a quietness that perhaps I hadn't ever really felt, or I would notice, you know, my creativity was off the charts in a way it had never been. I started painting, which is not something I had ever done. My writing was getting better and easier.
Cool.
You know, I would laugh at things in a way I hadn't really laughed at them before. You know, I remember like going on a few dates with a boy and feeling like a middle schooler. I was so giddy, and I hadn't felt that in 15 years. And so there were little things like that kind of, I was able to hold on to them because the ratio was really off. I would get one or two of those wonderful little moments followed by weeks of just awful hell. And so I had to just believe that there was going to be a time when I could balance that ratio of good to bad. But beyond that, I also kind of had the world around me telling me that I couldn't blame all of my issues on anyone or anything else anymore. Because once I started traveling and I was in a place that was unfamiliar, with people I didn't know, with food I couldn't digest very well, in a place that I couldn't, you know, speak the language in, suddenly the common denominator for all of your issues is you.
Is you, right?
So I couldn't blame it on my job. I couldn't blame it on my apartment or New York or any of these things. It was very clearly me.
Wow.
Which is rather sobering, and kind of, for me, gave me the push to get myself together, because there just really wasn't anyone else to blame this on anymore.
Wow.
And then the last thing was that I started doing an alternative form of therapy that really kind of cut deep into the issues that I was experiencing, but perhaps could not articulate very well.
Right.
And I continued to do this therapy as I traveled around the world, because it was all done remotely over the phone.
Okay.
So I was able to call my practitioner. His name is Edward. He started something called Compassion Key. He he has a very interesting story. He grew up super, super poor, like $1 a day kind of poor, ultimately worked his way up through the education system, got a master's from Columbia, I believe, and then went on some sort of spiritual quest of sorts and had, kind of like a lightning moment somewhere around the world. I don't know where he is, where this idea of self-compassion and how that can heal our inner wounds.
Right.
Was kind of formulated into something that could be done in more of a therapeutic way as opposed to, something that is only done in spiritual retreats kind of thing.
Right, so something with a practical application, as it were.
Yes, so he managed to package this, and my mom actually said, I think you need to give this a shot, because she had heard him talk on a radio show of some sort and said that it was really powerful to listen to, and then she gave me his name, and I was at this point where I had been, is before I started traveling. I had just gotten off my first drug, and I was having really, really terrible withdrawal symptoms, and had some pretty rough experiences with my psychiatrist, and I was just desperate to do anything. And it was over the phone, and I called him up, and we had a, kind of informational session, and by the end of it, I had, I was in tears and out of total release, and had felt like I had touched something that hadn't ever been addressed in myself before.
Wow.
After being on the phone with him for 90 minutes. So
that's pretty amazing.
I just kind of believed that there was another option and went through it.
Amazing. So you went on this journey. You were doing this therapy with Edward. So how long ago was that?
Well, honestly, it's still ongoing. So I don't work with Edward on a regular basis anymore, but I still utilize the techniques and be able to not only use them on myself, but also there are about 100 practitioners, I think, around the world now. So I have worked with some of them, kind of on a as needed basis.
Right. So
as opposed to just having, like a group of sessions.
Sure. So the story is still unfolding, as it were.
I mean, it is for everyone.
Well, absolutely. But I guess the thing is, you kind of were on this kind of global journey, and now, as you say, you're kind of what was the phrase you used around homeless?
Categorically homeless.
Categorically homeless. I love that. A digital nomad, as it were.
Yes.
So, kind of what happened between kind of finishing the journey around the world and kind of where you're at right now?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's kind of, there was never really an end to my traveling. I was initially traveling with a group called Remote Year, which was established to take digital nomads, people who could work remotely, and give them a set itinerary with a set group of friends to travel with. So you and 70 strangers who theoretically end up your best friends at the end of it. You go to 12 different places across for a year. And my program ended in August. So my program itself, was fairly dramatic. Like, I actually quit the program in the middle of it because I thought I was going to move to Cambodia, and then I didn't, and I came to Vancouver because I had, just needed to get out of the States, and I ended up in Vancouver. I met a guy, left 3 days later. Now I'm back here because now, he's my boyfriend and we're together, so I'm here all the time. And it was, so that's how I ended up in Vancouver. But once my remote year program ended, I, knew that I didn't want to go back to New York and go back to the life I was living. So I just kind of kept staying on the road. And in the meantime, I had actually gotten a book deal to write about my story, which ended up falling through a couple weeks before I was supposed to turn in my first draft. It just wasn't a good fit for everyone, so it turned out to be the absolute best decision. I have a manuscript, and now that's being kind of shopped around, and that process is a little bit soul-crushing for a writer who's impatient, but I know that it's ultimately going to be the right move. So that's kind of my big macro plan.
Gotcha.
And then on a micro scale, I'm a professional chef by trade. So I develop recipes, which I'm luckily able to do wherever I am as long as there's a kitchen. And
Amazing.
do a little bit of travel and food writing. And then I do some CrossFit coaching. I've been doing CrossFit for about 4 or 5 years now.
Wow. Okay.
So it's a very patchwork life.
Yeah, but not as you say though, it allows us to kind of sit on a beach in Vancouver at midday on a Friday.
I wouldn't have it any other way. I get very bored and distracted easily, so I like that I can jump from 3 different careers in one day.
Brilliant.
In order to make it work.
Well, but I mean that's kind of the reality of where life is these days, isn't it? So tell us a little bit about the book, and obviously you've there was an opportunity there, which is kind of now you going for a better fit. But where are you kind of going with like the book, and what do you want to do with it?
So my book is a memoir, and it's about what happened when I decided to get off these antidepressants and the therapy that I was using, and kind of how that speaks to the consequences and side effects of our lives.
Mm-hmm.
Like, for me, the thesis and the takeaway of the book is that I want people to realize that they can take control of their own lives, but that they have to take control of their own lives. They have to be in charge. They have to ask the right questions. They have to do things that feel right for them. And that's never going to make everybody happy, and you're probably going to piss a lot of people off in the process, which I definitely did, and I was definitely a jerk for a lot of my journey. But it was, I'm not proud of being a jerk, but I'm proud of doing what I needed to do in order to change my position in the world. So the book is about that, and it's, like I said, it's a memoir. It's not scientifically based. It's not an how-to of how to get off drugs. It's not, it's not talking about statistics. It's none of that. It's just like, here's my story. This is what happened to me. And hopefully, when people get a chance to read it, they will be able to realize that if they're, considering getting off antidepressants, that it is possible. There's not a lot of personal accounts of people who've managed to get off of them and stay off of them. Right. So I do hope it falls into that that sphere a little bit, but I also hope it falls into a little bit of a spiritual sphere that opens up people's minds a little bit, because, this therapy that I was using required me to kind of go to some pretty weird places that could be described as something like akin to a past life, or we could just say it's a metaphor that my brain had created in order to represent a situation. So I don't really care how people take it. Yeah, no. But the bottom line is, when I was, going through these things, I was having these visions of situations that I had certainly never been in, that had occurred in a time that was not now. Right. And yet it directly related to some deep-seated issue that I was having. Right. And so what we would do is we would work with these kind of visions that I was having, and send it, or very often the person, self-compassion, kind of ask it what it was trying to tell me. Yep. Until we got to a point where I felt like that was healed, that the wound was clear, and that I could kind of just mentally let that go through, for me personally, a lot of visual exercises. I'm a visual person, but for some people, they'll feel it kinetically in their body, or, some people hear it or whatever it is. Yeah, so I think whatever it is, it worked. Well, I think that's the key thing here, right? I mean, I'm a pretty spiritual person as well, but it's not necessarily whether it's like a past life, or whether it is, as you say, kind of a subconscious kind of metaphor or whatever. The point is, it had a tangible effect. Right. And it has something to tell you. I mean, I think we've become so good at, especially with technology moving as quickly as it is, and we have information so quickly, things are changing from one day to the next, as far as, what scientists are discovering. And, the big thing right now is mindfulness and meditation. Right. But it's not just mindfulness and meditation. It's the scientific community trying to figure out what it is about that actually affects you. Right. And so that's changing constantly, and we have all this new information about it. And I think, great. I think it's fantastic that people are approaching these subjects from all different walks of life. But I don't really care why my brain changes when I do this, as long as it works. Right. So for me, it's much easier to just kind of cut all that out and say, yeah, look, I was seeing this weird thing in my head, and I had a conversation with it, and I don't care if you think that's weird, but this bird told me that I was having issues with this. So I talked to the bird, we apologized to the bird, we sent the bird some compassion, and now it's better. I can't explain it. It worked.
Who cares?
Open
it
up your
worked.
mind and try it. It might work for you too.
Yeah, absolutely. So given all of this, what was it like kind of going back and writing this memoir, kind of reflecting on the journey you'd had? What kind of came out of that process?
When I initially had realized that I needed to write this book, and it was initially on a really tight deadline, what had happened was I was in Chile. I think? Yeah, I was in Chile.
Right.
And it was July, and I knew that at the end of August I would be going back to New York City because I needed to, I had stuff there. I had to deal with my life there before I decided if I was going to leave. And so I was really nervous to go back to New York, and not only to go back to New York because that's kind of where all this started, and I had created such a negative connotation around New York City because, it just got to a point where I didn't want to go outside of my apartment because I was just so uncomfortable in that city.
Right.
So I was nervous to go back there just on that level, but I was even more nervous to go back there and then get myself in a writing space where I was going to have to write about why being in New York was so terrible a year ago. And I really didn't trust myself in the beginning. I was afraid that going back into that place was kind of going to just it was going to put me back in that place, that I wouldn't be able to turn it off, and that I would just be stuck in whatever the emotions were that I was feeling at the time. And I was very scared of regressing.
Right.
But when I went back there, what I found was that I was lucky that I was in a position where I had just sold my bakery, so I had a little bit of freedom to just focus on my writing.
Great.
And so I had a goal of usually it was I think it was 1,000 words or 4 hours a day.
Right.
Whichever came first. And I found that I was really able to actually shut myself off at the end of a writing day, and that as I, kind of closed my eyes and I got into the writing, and especially as I got into the more difficult part of the writing, kind of reliving these experiences, for some reason, when I was done, I was done. And I didn't even have to try to, put up any sort of container or anything, like an emotional container to try and protect myself. It almost felt like I was writing about someone else, but someone I knew really, really, really well.
Wow, okay.
And I took that as a sign of just pure healing.
Yeah.
That I had gotten myself to a place where I was able to access the information I needed within me, and then not let it take over. It would have taken over, a couple of years before, and it certainly would have taken over when I was just off my medication and couldn't handle anything in the world.
Sure. So it was almost like an affirmation of closure, as it were.
Yeah. Amazing.
Absolutely amazing. So that was the book. I mean, and what I love about your story, Brooke, is it's super authentic, and let's face it, kind of even using the words kind of mental health are kind of not particularly right here because we're in a much bigger thing, but it's really up in the zeitgeist at the moment. There's a lot of stuff around the fact that so many people go through anxiety, depression, whatever version of that, and there's still a stigma attached to it and all that kind of thing. So I mean, what's your kind of thought these days, having been through this, having a real new sense of self? What would you say to kind of anyone who's out there who is maybe suffering but is either not in a position to do something about it or are scared to, or
my kind of core belief about all of this is that anything surrounding the idea of mental health and even your physical health is really just information. It's your body, it's your soul, whatever you want to call it, trying to tell you something.
Right.
And the problem is that a lot of times we say, okay, I'm anxious or I'm depressed, and we look at what's going on in our life right now.
Right.
And we try and find the source of the anxiety or depression in what's ever happening in your immediate world. Whereas, I don't think that some of these things, they come from things that happened to us 20 years ago. They come from things that happened as a child, maybe even things that happened when we were in the womb. Like all these sorts of things that are not necessarily related to the world we're in. So people look around, they say, okay, here's my situation. I can't do anything about XYZ. which may or may not be true. I do believe that, yes, we have the power to change our lives and control everything around us, but there are certain situations that, you can't just wave a wand and have it change. You can make small steps to change it, but it doesn't just change overnight. But by kind of looking at some of the things that happened to us when we were younger, or just some of these nebulous feelings we have, I think that once we start to address those feelings, that's when we can actually alleviate the depression, the anxiety, or, the whatever random physical ailment you have when you go to a doctor and they're like, well, we can't find anything wrong with you, but you're like, well, why am I sick? All these things, it's your body trying to tell you something. So that's normally where, when people ask me that question, I kind of say that the first question is to ask, why is this happening?
Yeah.
What is this telling me? And that can be really hard to do because, one, very often it's going to come back to you being the problem, which nobody wants to deal with.
No one wants to hear that, right?
Yeah. But also, just that I would love to encourage people to be a little bit more selfish, specifically when it comes to doing the deep self-hard work.
Right.
People want to shut down. They don't want to talk to anyone about their issues. If they're like me, maybe they've gone to traditional therapists or psychiatrists and had experiences that result in medication, which I think are, often a good Band-Aid, but kind of just mask the ultimate problem.
Right.
Or, perhaps they just get disillusioned from the whole process anyway. They sit, they internalize, they let it stew, and then, lo and behold, they get some sort of weird disease like 10 years down the line that's, stress-related or something. But there's so many different options and different ways for people to address their issues, and it takes you, you've got to be the one to go out there and look for it. Like, Google it. I mean, start with Googling alternative depression therapies. Or,
right.
And just start following some threads. Try things for a little while. But, the choices, I just don't believe that the choices are cope with depression, cope with antidepressants, or some hybrid of the two.
Right.
I really do believe that there is a way out of this.
Right. And I mean, take me the right way here. You're a living example of that right here in front. I can see that.
Yeah.
So okay, let's kind of bring this into present day, as it were. You have written the book. You're doing recipe development. You're doing a bit of CrossFit, that kind of stuff. Where do you see this going, as it were? Where do you have not necessarily a plan, but do you have kind of thoughts about where you'd like it to go, or are you just kind of taking it as it comes, or?
I have the sort of plan that is me not being able to sleep at night, where I just fantasize about 10 years into the future, where I'm wildly successful and my book has been turned into a movie and all of these things that, every creative has probably been fantasizes about. And then I have the more realistic, like, okay, what are you going to do about that in the next 3 months kind of thing. And so that's really kind of where I live right now. I mean, when you don't know where you're going to sleep in a week or in a month, it kind of helps you to roll with the punches a little bit. So I'm trying to just be open to any experience that comes my way, as far as being able to talk and tell my story. So I believe that the more I talk about it, the more the right people are going to hear it. And whether or not that's just people who, they just take a little bit of maybe something I've said and they're able to apply it to their own life and it gets better. Or, on the other end of the scale, the right person who calls up and says, hey, I want to publish their book. Like, that would be awesome too. I'll definitely take that. But I like that I don't entirely know what my life looks like right now. And it's forcing me to not be so future focused, which comes with future anxieties. So, it's a balance of not being frivolous with what I have, but also not giving too much thought about what's going to happen totally in the future. Like, it's good to have a nest egg, but I don't need to pinch every penny just in case kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So given that you've kind of been through, lots of kind of self-exploration, all that kind of stuff, what do you do now on a daily basis to kind of, what's your kind of self-care look like now?
I'm not too big on hard set routines. I kind of know what I'm going to do the next day, maybe the night before. If I have a day where I'm going to be doing a lot of heavy personal writing, I usually start with about 45 minutes of just kind of mind dump journaling that is, highly uninteresting and usually just says things like, oh, I need to do the laundry and there's a bird outside, that sort of thing. But I do it all by hand just to kind of focus for that 45 minutes. If I'm not having a day where I'm doing heavy personal writing and I'm either doing more like, some food writing or something that's a little bit just less, that requires less of a deep flow, I might start the day with a little 10-minute meditation of some sort or just some quiet sitting. And then I try and move in some capacity every single day. If I can walk as opposed to drive, I'll do it, even if it takes an extra hour. Like I walked here today. It took me an hour. I could have taken a bus in 10 minutes, but I decided to walk. And that's kind of it. I'm pretty stringent about how and what I eat. Like I'm a professional chef, so I love going out to eat, but I feel so much better when I'm careful about what I put in my body. So I tend to keep most of my meals the same, and then I'll mix it up once in a while.
Cool.
For, a dinner out or something.
Yeah. Makes sense.
But beyond that, I don't know. I'm fairly boring. Like, at this point, I stay... I don't do much. Like, I stare at a computer, but other than that, like...
I don't think the word boring is the one that would spring to mind for me, personally. But
well, the highlights are on the internet, but when, everything else in between is a lot of just... sweatpants and computer time.
Absolutely. That's the life of the digital generation, right? So if you were kind of, you for take me the right way here, I don't mean this to sound kind of condescending or anything, but for someone who is kind of relatively young, you've built a lot of wisdom. So if you were kind of looking back now, giving some advice to, say, your then 15-year-old self.
My 15-year-old self.
What would you say to her?
Oh, my 15-year-old self wouldn't have listened, and I think that's the general issue, right? Like, I'm sure there were people running around telling me smart things, and I just refused to listen to it. I feel like I've only started to learn to listen in my 30s.
Right. Okay.
There's kind of that point when you start noticing your first few wrinkles and your body's not working the same anymore, and it's just kind of like, crap, I think I physically peaked and I don't know what I'm talking about. So now as my body goes downhill, I need to work on my mind and my wisdom in order to balance myself as a person.
I'm glad we're saying this on my 46th birthday. Thank you, Brooke.
Well, you're about to go get all sorts of wisdom on your quest. So
well, this is true. This is true. So, on all of this though, what's the best piece of advice you've been given?
I think probably the one that sticks with me most was last year. Someone just kept telling me to stay flexible, and I felt like, at least for last year, and just in general, that's just really it's a good piece of solid wisdom, because the bottom line is no one's life is ever going to be predictable. Even the most predictable of lives still have, some stuff that comes up, and it's so much easier to just lean into whatever has come at you and just like shrug your shoulders and say like, okay, I thought I was going straight, but there's a roadblock sign there, so now we're turning. Like, it's so much easier to operate under that pretense than under the one where you're trying to micromanage every little thing that comes at you. And I find that when you become a little bit more flexible, you also become more open to noticing when opportunities come your way.
Right.
It kind of drives me nuts when I hear people say like they can't change anything, or no one cares about them, or all of these things, and it's just like, no, that's not the case. You're just not seeing it right now. You're not looking at it.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like that thing where everyone says, oh, you never notice cars on the road until you get that one particular car, and then you see those cars everywhere.
Right.
So by staying flexible and just kind of paying attention to all the weird little things instead of just dismissing them right away, you start to notice all these bizarre things that come in. Like, for example, getting to chat with you this afternoon, like, you emailed me out of the blue, and you know, the me of 5 years ago might have said like, oh, I don't want to do that, that's embarrassing, or who the hell knows, I might have just dismissed it or deleted it. But why?
Here we are. Yeah,
like,
absolutely.
like, you're gonna die at the end of the day, who cares?
Yeah, right. The one of the things that's coming through loud and clear for me here is this kind of notion of the word responsibility. And, you know, I think for a lot of people, and, you know, including for me for a very long time, that word is almost like when people say you are 100% responsible for your life, that's both the best news and the worst news on the planet, right? Because, as you say, there's no one else to blame, as it were. What is... that can be quite a hard message for people to hear, even though I think it's completely 100% true.
Especially for people who feel like what has happened to them is totally out of their control. Like,
right. So what's the piece of advice you'd give that person to kind of ease into that kind of message, as it were?
You know, I think it's a combination of... I think there's a lot of forgiveness involved, and a lot of compassion that needs to happen, and not necessarily, you know, forgiveness is a hard word, because especially for people who were wronged by adults if they were children, or who feel like they had some things taken away from them, you know, like, you know, there's so much anger surrounding that. But I think giving yourself the space to grieve and act in a way that perhaps is not considered, I don't want to use the word appropriate, but attractive. Like, you know, I think grief happens throughout our lives constantly, and not just for people or loved ones who have died. I think we grieve all parts of our lives pretty frequently. Like, you know, if you're living in a place for a decade and you move, and it's really emotional because you're grieving the life you're living. You left there, you know, you grieve relationships you've lost, even if people didn't pass away. You grieve jobs you had that meant a lot to you. So there's this constant state of grief, I think, that people are always in, but they don't give themselves the forgiveness or the compassion to actually feel that and to experience the process that is needed in order to move through it. So but then we hold on to all that stuff, and it, you know, it bottles up over time. And grief in general is just such a bitch because it's not linear. It's very cyclical, and it's often triggered by things that have no relevance to to the issue, right? Like, you know, a loved one passes away, and then 2 years later you're walking down the street and you see a flower and you start crying, and you're like, what the hell? You don't realize that that flower was in your grandmother's garden and you hadn't thought of it, you know? It's just so out of the blue. But when that's kind of happening to us all the time, we have to understand that we are going to have emotions regarding or surrounding all of the things that happen to us. It's not something that needs to be pushed down. It's something that needs to be experienced, because if you don't experience, it's just going to keep coming up more and more and more and more until it hits you over the head so hard that you are emotionally or mentally incapacitated in one way or the other, and you are forced to deal with it. And that is way worse than just having a good cry once a week and appearing vulnerable.
Absolutely. And let's face it, we kind of exist in a, well, I guess I'm generalizing about Western societies here. We're kind of almost in a society these days where it's so head-driven, and we're almost so scared of emotion and all that kind of stuff. And I think that you can almost see it playing out on the macro stage, right? Imagine what world politics would be like if we actually just dealt with some of our pent-up emotions.
Seriously.
Quite amazing, as it were. So there's there's a very strong narrative here to everything you're saying around, you know, it's okay to, and actually it's necessary to really allow that emotionality to come through and all of that kind of stuff.
I think it's a requirement that is so overlooked. We really don't teach people how to cope with emotion of any kind. It's always like, oh, you're feeling badly, like, fix it. Stop, fix it. And, you know, like, obviously that's we all understand that, right? Like nobody wants to see somebody else in pain.
No, right.
Also, I don't have children, but I've watched friends whose kids are screaming, and all they want to do is stop it, not only to help the kid feel better, but for their own sanity. Like,
right.
It's difficult to see other people in pain. You can't do anything about it. It also can be really annoying sometimes, like that friend who's always down in the dumps. Like, nobody wants to be around that person. So it's always like, fix your shit and be happy. But the thing is that coping and happiness, it's like it's a skill. It has to be practiced, and we don't get a chance to practice it unless we go through it and actually make a conscious effort to fix it. But there was, I think it's in Sweden. It's one of the Nordic countries. I can't remember. It has this really, really wonderful practice. I believe it's at a college where at the same time every night, it's like 11 o'clock or something, all the students stick their head out the window and scream at the top of their lungs.
Seriously?
And they just scream out their grievances or their stresses around their exam or whatever it is. And it's like this alarm bell that runs over the campus where people just scream to get it out.
Amazing.
And I think all the time about, like, what could this world be like if it was somehow acceptable, or we had a safe place to have like a screaming practice.
Right.
Because there, so much of, what I personally have worked on has been this overwhelming feeling of just wanting to scream at the top of my lungs because I'm so angry. So filled with rage and so angry. And it's so inappropriate in public, right? Like, unless you're 2, you're not allowed to do it.
That's true.
So I spent a long time trying to figure out how to actually, like, deal with that, because the only thing that was making me feel better was to scream at the top of my lungs, which was really unsafe. Felt really unsafe.
Yeah. I get that totally.
So, I mean, it's making me sound nuts, but whatever. You start screaming into pillows, like you go underwater and you just scream at the top of your lungs, whatever it is. Just once I started doing it, like, I felt so much better because whatever was in me just finally got out. And that's how it manifested for me. It's just like this verbal need to get it out. So, I looked at that college and wherever it is, and I just kind of, have these fantasies about being able to stick my head out the window along with everybody else in the neighborhood and just scream for like 30 seconds. And then everybody goes back about their lives, and it's just like, yeah, it's just what we do. Like,
I love that. That's brilliant. I can't remember. I remember speaking to someone once. They were talking about, they had this idea of like a light bulb smashing booth. So basically, when you're really angry, you could go in and just like smash light bulbs, and I think
God, there's so much glass.
I know,
Gotta be careful with that.
Yeah, I know. I think the screen is probably safer, but the truth is, with emotion, there comes energy, right?
Right.
And that's physical energy. So we have to do something with it. So what I love about that is when you actually like allow yourself to scream, or I don't know, mash the pillow as I've done a few times or whatever, you can actually do something. You're doing something about it, and then you get some kind of perspective,
right?
Which is amazing.
Yeah, and people say, they're like, oh, that's why I go to the gym, or this is why I do boxing, and I as someone who's been very physical my whole life, and I love to lift weights and grunt in the gym and all that. That's fine, but unless I'm feeling that huge amount of emotion right in that moment, it's like it doesn't really transfer for me. So it's always been the struggle to figure out, okay, like, if it's 2 o'clock on a Tuesday and I am really angry and just want to, scream, and I'm in an apartment where other people can hear me, like, what do you do? And then you just kind of feel like there's nowhere to do it. Like, I want to rent a soundproof room.
Absolutely,
and just be able to, start leaning into some sort of crazy screaming rock music. Like, that's why they do it.
Yeah, absolutely. There really is a business opportunity here, I'm sure.
Yeah, I've been knocking around this business idea, which it requires some skills that I'm not necessarily sure I have, like, knowledge of real estate and all those sorts of things. But I feel like you get a room, pat it, you put some Nerf balls in it or something, and let people, just lose their minds. And then, on the other side of it is they walk out, and there's like this lovely little Zen Buddhist garden or something where you can kind of calm down, have some tea, touch a crystal or whatever, and then we'll have some lovely shaman or something come and bless the room after each person has screamed in it. Yeah, I think it should happen.
Absolutely, I can totally see that, and I can see like a global chain of them. Or,
exactly.
Perfect. So, okay. So just a couple more questions, just to bring this home as well. I've just seen that touching the amethysts, and that kind of stuff. final two questions, and these are kind of quite big ones that I always ask every guest. So the first one is, you know, at Mavericks, we're all about creating a world that works for all. That's kind of our big MO. So if there was one change you could make in the world, what would that change be, and what would be your first step towards it?
Yeah,
have to.
Okay, so the first one is just to prioritize the deep self-work. You know, I'd love for there to be, like, everyone to have a dedicated hour twice a week where, you know, they have someone who they can call and talk to that doesn't cost $700 an hour.
Right.
You know, that's actually functional and works for each individual person. And for people to be willing to go and do the hard places and not avoid the emotion, because if you heal yourself, that reflects on the rest of the world.
Right.
So, you know, that's my spiritual woo answer. My practical answer is that I think that for 6 months right out of college or high school, everyone should have to work in food service or retail. So people just become less of jerks.
Yeah. Well, I certainly did that. I worked at Pizza Hut for 6 months, so, you know,
I think it should be mandatory. Like, you can choose. You can either go to, like, an army boot camp, or you can work at Olive Garden. Whatever it is, you're gonna get yelled at. You're gonna have, like, crap happen to you, and you're gonna become a more compassionate person when you're talking to others.
Ego management. I love it. I absolutely love it. Didn't see that one coming. So there you go, Brooke. It's been an amazing conversation. Thank you so much for joining me on this amazing day in Vancouver. Oh my God, I can't quite believe it. I love the amount of wisdom you have. That you're so just open about everything you've been through, and I think, you know, that is a real. If that's what comes through in the book and that's what people get, then that's going to help a lot of people, and I really love that, and I love that it's kind of almost a calling for you to do that. So thank you so much for joining us today on the Mavericks Unlimited podcast.
You're welcome. Thank you so much for having me.
And there you go, Mavericks. This was Krish with Brooke Siem, and I'll see you next time on the Mavericks Unlimited podcast. Bye for now.
Bye. Thanks so much.
Hey, listen up. Don't go yet. Did you get something meaningful out of this episode? Well, the most meaningful thing that you can do right now is to go and leave a review on iTunes, because those reviews are what keep us here. And please make sure to share and to subscribe to this podcast. Finally, are you unleashing your superpowers? Well, if so, show us on Instagram with the hashtag Mavericks Unlimited, and we'll see you over there. And with that, thanks so much for listening to the Mavericks Unlimited podcast at mavericsunlimited.com. Bye for now.